Some big storms, some life storms, and some literal storms have hit our country this year. On August 29th, which was actually my birthday, a literal storm hit our country. Hurricane Laura, Category 4, ripped through Louisiana, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Florida. Caused $14 billion worth of damage and 77 deaths. Now, I've been in a couple of big storms in my life, but maybe the biggest was a tornado that touched down near my home in my teenage years. It touched down about 100 yards from my house in an apartment complex, tore up some apartment buildings, jumped back up and put down right in the sports complex of my high school. It picked up the baseball bleachers from the baseball diamond that I played on, twisted them up in the air and set them down in the outfield of our baseball diamond. Me and my family sheltered in our basement. The power went out in the wake of that tornado because the refrigerators and freezers were no longer working. My dad said, just eat anything you want. So we had steak several days until the freezer thawed everything out. When I went to look up a little bit of research on this particular tornado, I was surprised to find out that it was actually called the tornado outbreak of November 1992. There's an actual Wikipedia entry for this series of tornadoes that ripped through our country. It was a 3-day outbreak that struck the eastern and Midwestern United States on November 21st to the 23rd. Wikipedia says this exceptionally long-lived and geographically large outbreak produced 95 tornadoes over a 41-hour period. It was one of the longest lasting and largest outbreaks ever recorded in the United States. There were 26 fatalities, 641 injuries, and over 3 million in damage. You might not be in a literal storm right now, but all of us are in some sort of life storm right now. Maybe you're in a storm of divorce, a storm of depression, a financial storm, a relational storm, a parenting storm, a schooling storm, or all of us, I think, are in the storm of COVID. We've been talking about the presence of God in different seasons of our life throughout this series. We each experience God in different ways depending on what we're going through. In episode 1 of this series, we looked at God with us in the valley. You see, you may enjoy getting to know God on the mountaintop, but it's in the valley where you really get to know God intimately. In episode 2 of this series, we looked at encountering God in the wilderness. God whispers in the wilderness because God is close. You see, our deepest needs in the wilderness, they become a gift when they drive us to depend on God. Guess what we're talking about today? You got it. God with us in the storm. I'm here at the Lake Lansing Sailing Club because, well, this is about the only lake that exists in the area of Lansing. My family and I are members of the sailing club, and it seems like it's in or around lakes where storms tend to happen the most. You're either coming out of a storm, in a storm, or about to go through a storm. So today is episode 3. This series concludes this week with our Christmas Eve services. I hope that you'll join us. And Christmas Eve, we're going to explore how God is with us always. Our theme verse for this series has been from Matthew's gospel. An angel of the Lord is speaking to Joseph and says, "Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. God with us in the valleys, in the wilderness, in the storm, God with us always. You know, Christmas is always a bit of a storm for us, whatever year it is, but it's especially so this year. And we at Sycamore Creek, we normally celebrate Christmas in all kinds of places, in pubs and diners, in churches. We celebrate it at all different kinds of times, on Christmas Eve, on Christmas Eve, on Christmas Eve. But this year we're celebrating Christmas Eve a little bit differently. We're celebrating it from our living room to yours. We're going to have 2 premiere services on Thursday, December 24th at 5 and 7 p.m., both on Facebook and on YouTube. And then we're going to do a very brief with emphasis on brief, outdoor service at 9 p.m. outside both of our campuses. That's for those of you who want to get together, sing Silent Night, and try to keep a candle lit in the midst of whatever the weather is like that evening. I hope you would invite somebody to join us for one of these Christmas services. You see, somebody you know is going through a storm. Somebody you know is going through a valley. Somebody that you know is in the wilderness. And somebody that you know needs to know that God is with them always. They need the message of Christmas. So invite somebody. Invite 2 people. Invite 3 people. Host a watch party on your Facebook page. So today we're talking about God with us in the storms. I'd love to hear any stories that you have about being in a literal storm. Let's talk about that. Sometimes I think when we go through a storm, we are tempted to blame God for the storm. Where is God? Why would God allow this to happen? Why? Why doesn't God do something? Now, I don't think it's bad to ask God why. In fact, when Jesus hung on the cross, he said, my God, why? And if the Son of God can ask God why, then it must be okay for us as followers of Jesus to ask God why too. Now, here's the main point I want you to get today. Never allow the presence of a storm to cause you to doubt the presence of God. We're going to take a look at a story about Paul, the first missionary of the church and the author of many of the books of the Bible. It's about Paul on a boat. Now, I told you I'm here at the Lake Lansing Sailing Club, and it happens to be the winter season, so most of the boats here are shrink wrapped up, ready to not be taken out again, and that's the way sailing goes, right? You have to know when to go out, and you have to know when it's not safe to go out. In the book of Acts, chapter 27, Paul finds himself on a boat. He's on a boat in a storm going on for day after day after day after day. In fact, the storm is so bad that the shipmates begin to throw the cargo off of the boat. They didn't expect to make it out alive. Now, the way this story is told is really interesting because there's this plural we in it, which suggests that Paul had a traveling partner who's telling the story. In fact, maybe the traveling partner was the author of the book Acts, Luke. And here's how Luke tells the story. He says, when neither sun nor stars reappeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. They gave up all hope of being saved. This is a really bad storm, right? Some of you have given up all hope. You've given up hope that your marriage will make it. You've given up hope and you think that you are always going to be single and alone, that you're never going to get out of debt, that you're never going to have a child. You've given up hope that you will even graduate from school, that you are always going to be depressed, that you will never get out from underneath this addiction, and that COVID will never be over. The storm just continues raging. Luke goes on and says, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. Now, Paul had warned them not to go. He said the conditions weren't great. Really, we should all be dry docked like these boats here. We shouldn't go out in this weather. We shouldn't go out in these conditions. I find it interesting that no matter how mature Paul was, he's the author of many of the books of the Bible, that he isn't above in this moment saying, I told you so. If you had listened to me, we wouldn't be here right now. Some of us are in a storm because we went out when the conditions weren't safe. No! When you didn't know how to responsibly operate a boat. When you decided to bring the cat along with you and you should have left it at home. In these moments, it's tempting to blame the storm on the devil. But really what we should do, we should blame the storm on ourselves. On our own poor, unwise decisions. You chose unwisely.
You chose poorly.
My family had a ski boat growing up. We lived on a reservoir called Geist Reservoir, just north of Indianapolis. And I like to take my friends out water skiing or kneeboarding from time to time. And one time I made a stupid decision. I let one of my friends who was inexperienced at driving a boat, pulling a skier, be at the wheel. He took a turn and let the tension out of the line and then pulled the boat straight again. When the line snapped, our friend who was in the back being pulled along went down in the water. Nothing seemed all that unusual. We went back, we picked our friend up out of the water, but when he got up onto the boat, we saw that he had a rope burn across his neck. I get a sinking feeling in my stomach when I think back on this. And I am grateful that all that it turned out to be was a rope burn. It could have turned out so much worse. But you know who made the stupid decision that day? It wasn't my friend at the wheel. He was inexperienced. It wasn't my friend skiing. It was me. I was the one who made the decision to let someone inexperienced pull another person behind the boat skiing. Sometimes the storms in our life are there because of our own poor decisions. Maybe you're in a storm because you just spent too much money. You mouthed off when you should have kept your mouth closed. You weren't considerate. You procrastinated. You didn't listen when all your friends told you not to date that person. Your mama told you not to date him. Your pastor told you not to date him. You even opened a fortune cookie that said there is a spanking in your near future, and you still dated that person. Maybe this is one of the reasons that Paul's shipmates had given up hope. You see, it was their decision to go out when conditions were unfavorable for sailing. They were in the storm because of their own decisions. Do you know it's easier to trust in God when you're in a storm? When it was God who's the one who actually led you into the storm? When you took that leap of faith, trusting in God's leading? When you took that new job when it paid so much less, but it paid high in purpose and meaning? When you started a new ministry at our church in an area that you never thought you'd be able to minister to other people's needs? When you joined in a new mission on a new mission field that God had put a burning passion in your heart? When you took on a new challenge? A challenge that you weren't sure that you could actually accomplish. A challenge like our Christmas offering challenge, to give away as much as you spend on Christmas. And then you end up seeing what God can really do when you follow God's leading into a storm. We've been doing this Christmas offering challenge for several years, but the last couple of years, it's really taken off. In 2018, we received $27,000 in our Christmas offering that we ended up giving away the next year. In 2019, we received $32,000. We give this all away to our care ministries. We give it to local missions and to our global missions. What will God do with the challenge this year? I mean, it's a double challenge, right? We're in the midst of COVID, and it's Christmas, and there's this challenge that our church puts before us every year to give away as much as we spend on ourselves. How will God meet us in that challenge? See us through what seems like it might be a storm. It's easier to believe that God will get you out of a storm when God was the one who led you into it, rather than your own poor decisions. It's more difficult when you got yourself into it. Now, for some of the crew on the boat, it actually wasn't their decision. It's not some of their faults. Some of the crew might not have wanted to go out. Maybe you're going through a storm right now that's not because of your decision, but because of somebody else's poor decision, and you're just being chopped up in the wake of it. How many of you have been in a storm because of somebody else? Now, I know it's awkward. Don't elbow that person sitting next to you at home. Don't type their name in the comments. You can send me a private message if you want. Maybe your parents got a divorce. I went through that as a kid. And one of the things that kids of divorced parents struggle with is thinking that it was their fault, but it's not. Or maybe your company made a bad decision, lost a lot of money, had to lay people off, including you. Or maybe you trusted somebody. You trusted them with your most intimate details of your life, and they betrayed that trust. Remember the main point of today's message. Never let the presence of a storm cause you to doubt the presence of God. All right, after Paul's had his sanctimonious "I told you so" moment, he goes on to say this: "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. He said an angel stood beside him. That's pretty intense. Christians have this idea of guardian angels. I mean, it's like angels are all around us. Here it's like, poof, there's one. Poof, there's one. Poof. An angel stood beside Paul. There are angels all around us. In fact, even more so, God's Spirit dwells with us. God's Spirit dwells in us. God hears your prayers and your crying. God comforts and guides us. It's like when my boys climb up in my lap, and I can't always fix everything that's hurting, but it's just enough to hold them and comfort them. Never allow the presence of a storm to cause you to doubt the presence of God. This isn't the only place in the Bible where we see God's presence in challenging times. Paul, in his letter to Timothy, his mentee, says, "Everyone deserted me, but the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength." Psalm 16 says, "I know the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me." Earlier this fall, I took my boys canoe camping on the Manistee River. I'd never taken them out into the wilderness in a canoe in such a way before. It was just me, Dad, and my two boys. When we put in onto the Manistee River, I'm sitting in the back and I'm steering and paddling. Micah, my oldest son, is sitting in the front paddling, and Sam is sitting on the ground in between us. The Manistee River doesn't have many rapids, but it does have maybe some class 1 or class 1/2 rapids. And when we got into the middle of one of those, I found myself saying, "Oh, what have I gotten myself into? Do I have what it takes to lead these boys through 2 days of paddling on the Manistee River?" But you know, something I noticed about them, they never seemed anxious. They never seemed worried. They never seemed to wonder whether we were going to make it through this. Why is that? Because Dad was in the canoe. You know, it's all about who is in the boat with you. I'd love to hear stories from you about when was a time you were in a situation, but you were not worried because of who was in it with you. Let's talk about that. It really does matter who's with you in the boat, doesn't it? Who's with you in the storm that you're in the situation in life. Matthew and Mark, two of Jesus' earliest followers, both tell a story in their book in the Bible about Jesus being in a storm with his disciples, but Jesus is asleep in the boat. How can you sleep in a boat in the middle of a storm? Peace isn't found in the absence of a storm. Peace is found in the presence of Jesus. Why did Paul experience peace in the midst of that storm on the boat? It wasn't because the situation wasn't bad. It was because he understood that Jesus was there in the boat with him, that God was there in the boat with him. Peace isn't found in a trouble-free life. In fact, Jesus says, "I have told you this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows." That's a promise of Jesus. You will have many trials and sorrows on this earth. How many of you have that on a Post-it note on your mirror in your bathroom? But take heart, because I have overcome the world. All right, let's get back to Paul and his story on the boat. "Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.'" Now, I'm not a believer in the idea that you've got a day set aside and it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to die on that day and only that day. In fact, just the other day, I was reading in Christianity Today, a magazine, about a new piece of research that came out, and 73% of, quote, born-again Protestants believe that God will keep them from getting infected by COVID. 73% believe this. That's a pretty dangerous kind of way of thinking, because it suggests that maybe you don't have to do anything to keep yourself safe, and really to keep others safe. But I do think it's appropriate to pray to God and say, "God, get me through this storm because I've got more work to do in your kingdom." Like Paul, I got to go see Caesar. I've got more books to write. I've got more letters to write. I've got letters that are going to end up in the Bible. I've got my kids to take care of. I've got this important work that you've called me to do. I've got this ministry in a church. I've got this person that I need to continue to be telling people about you. I've got people that I need to keep showing your grace so that they know that you do really love them. I've got work to do here to bring your kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. God, get me out of this storm because there's more work for me to do for you. When you pray, don't pray, God, get me out of this storm so my life can get back to normal, so I can be happy again. Rather, pray this prayer. Pray, God, get me out of this storm because there's more work for me to do. There's another ministry I need to start. I need to continue building this anti-racist movement in Lansing and the region. I've got more missions to be a part of. I've got my family and my kids to point towards you. Here's a question I'd like to talk about. What more do you have to do for God's mission in this world that you haven't yet done? Let's talk about that. There's really more work for all of us to do in God's mission in this world, isn't there? I'm going to take us back, all right? I'm going to take us back to the year that I was born, 1975. How many of you remember the World Series that year? Maybe some of you do. If you do, you'll probably remember Bernie Carbo. Bernie Carbo was an outfielder and a designated hitter for the Boston Red Sox. He actually grew up in Detroit, so he's a Michigander from Detroit. The Boston Red Sox trailed the Cincinnati Reds by 3 points going into the 8th inning. They needed a win to stay in the series. 2 men were on base, and Bernie Carbo stepped up to bat. The count ended up at 2-2, 2 balls and 2 strikes, when the pitcher threw a fastball and Bernie hit it, and it went over the outfield fence. It was a home run for 3 runs. It was the highlight of Bernie Carbo's life. Now on the outside, Bernie's life looked amazing, but on the inside, he was in the middle of a storm. You see, Bernie had a serious insecurity problem. His marriage was falling apart, and he was addicted to drugs. In fact, he had taken drugs even before that game that he hit the home run in. After the World Series, he bounced around in Major League Baseball from one team to another before eventually washing out. He moved back to Michigan to study, get this, cosmetology. He opened a salon, but that didn't last for long. One year, his mom died by suicide, and his dad died later that year. He inherited some money from them, and he went through it in 3 months, spending it on drugs. His cocaine use was eventually outed by another Major League Baseball player, and his life spiraled deeper and deeper. He was also considering dying by suicide when his phone rang one day, and a former teammate rallied around him. A former teammate who had lost his own daughter connected him with help. He was admitted to rehab and then into the hospital, and it was in the hospital in a room where he met a retired pastor who shared the room with him, who told him about Jesus. This was the beginning of the turnaround for Bernie Carbo. He eventually remarried. Although he still had some things to learn, that marriage almost got a divorce, but they worked it out. He did have another relapse in 1994, but he's been sober ever since. He goes around the nation these days telling this story, and here's what he says about why he tells his story. Today, I share this story across the nation because I want others to know there is hope. There is a way out of the deadly seduction of abusing drugs. There's a way out of the anger and anguish that life can bring. Not only does Jesus Christ offer the way out, but he also offers the way in to a life more joyful and abundant than anyone could imagine. Truly, our God is an awesome God. You see, whatever storm you're going through right now, God can use what you learn in that storm to help somebody else through their storm. You've survived the storm of cancer, and you can help somebody else find faith. You've overcome unfaithfulness in your marriage. You can help somebody else heal and forgive. You've climbed out of debt. You can tell others that it can be done. You're 178 days sober. You can tell others that Christ can and will set you free. You can become an evangelist for the presence of God in the storm. You can get to the point where you say, I really wouldn't want to do that again, But because I went through that storm, I'm grateful for what God taught me and how God is using me to help others in the storm. What storm do you need to be an evangelist for God's presence in the midst of it? I love to talk about this question. What storm from your past has God used to help someone else through their current storm? Let's talk about that. God has amazing work for all of us before us if we'll only remember that God is present in the storm. So let's get back to Paul's storm. He says, "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." Faith is not what I see. Faith is in what God says. Faith is not in the boat. It's faith in the one in the boat. Faith is not in the boat. It's faith in the one who commands the winds and the wave. You can't control your situation. You can't control when the storm starts or when it ends or how it hits or how long it lasts. You can't control what other people do, what people think amidst the storm. What you can control is who you listen to, what you say, where you will place your faith. What God says will happen. As Psalm 46 says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. Even if the economy tanks, I will trust in God. Even if my relationships break down, I will trust in God. Even if I don't get that job, God is present with me in the storm. God is what I need. God is my safety, my strength, my comforter, my source of life, my redeemer, my sustainer, my provider, my assurance, my salvation." Never let the presence of a storm cause you to doubt the presence of God. Peace isn't found in the absence of a storm. It's found in who's in the boat with you. "The virgin shall be with child, and they shall call him Emmanuel," which means God with us.